Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council, the most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Each time a cow is not bred during a 21-day heat cycle, it can cost up to 39 pounds of weaning weight per calf. The BCRC value of Calving Distribution Calculator is a free and easy-to-use tool that allows beef producers to measure their current calving distribution and shows how shifting towards industry targets could boost their bottom line. Try out this tool and more at beefresearch.ca or linked in the show notes. This episode features BCRC's Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the June 2025 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine. It's been reposted on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. And today we're talking about Forage Without Borders. Now, Doug Ray is a rancher from Irricana, Alberta. He and his family won the CCA's Environmental Stewardship Award in 2023, as a matter of fact. But about 20 years ago, Doug drove in from Irricana one day to ask us why the beef industry didn't fund more forage breeding. And back then, the usual beef industry response to any sort of forage proposals was, well, we can let the government and forage groups fund that. Then Doug calmly explained that the forage groups that he was active in don't have a checkoff. And so if beef cattle producers wanted better forage varieties, beef cattle producers would need to start investing in forage breeding. So when we looked into it, we found out that there really weren't very many forage breeders left in Canada. So then we talked to some universities and government folks, and they explained to us that low beef industry funding over the years had signaled to them that forage breeding wasn't a priority to us. So as a result, when forage breeders retired, they didn't replace them, and their long-term breeding and management programs had been scaled back or closed, and there were hardly any of them left standing at that point. So then the beef industry began to invest in forage breeding, largely thanks to the National Beef Cattle Checkoff. And then universities and Ag Canada slowly began to reinvest in a whole new generation of forage breeders. Canada has fewer forage breeders now than we did 40 years ago, but the ones we have are very enthusiastic and they're in tune to the industry and they're working really hard to address industry priorities. Now, two of these are Bill Biligetu at the University of Saskatchewan and Annie Claessens at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Quebec City station. And they recently published a study comparing how different forage varieties perform under different growing conditions across North America. And the online version of this article links to that published research paper if you want to read that. So what did they do? Well, this research team evaluated the yields of registered varieties and experimental populations, so varieties under development, from 4 different tame perennial grasses, and they did this at 7 locations across Canada and the US. So they evaluated 9 different meadow bromes, 9 different orchard grasses, 7 tall fescues, and 10 timothies. And they grew plots and harvested them in 2019, 2020, and 2021. This was under dryland conditions in Beaver Lodge, Alberta, Saskatoon and Swift Current, Saskatchewan, St. Augustine and Normandin, Quebec, and then under irrigation in Millville and Panguitch, Utah. And what they learned was that meadow brome and timothy produced the highest yields at all the sites except at Normandin, Quebec, and at Panguitch, Utah, where orchard grass and tall fescue outperformed the timothy. But they also found some location by variety interaction. And what a location by variety interaction means is that the grass variety that had the highest overall yield when you average across all the different sites didn't necessarily have the highest yield at each and every individual site. So when yields were averaged across all 6 sites, the 3 highest yielding meadow bromes were Armada, which was registered by Agriculture Canada in Saskatoon in 2009. An experimental population called S9498 from the University of Saskatchewan, UTMBB, which is an experimental strain from Utah. And those 3 meadow bromes out-yielded the bottom 2 varieties by 8%. That's on average. But Armada's high overall yield was because it performed so well under irrigation in Millville, Utah. But experimental meadow brome populations from Quebec and Utah actually performed better in Normandin, Saskatoon, and Swift Current, and paddock meadow brome, which came from Saskatoon in 1987, was the one that produced the best yields in St. Augustin, Quebec. In terms of orchard grass, the top performing varieties were Killarney, which was from Agriculture Canada Brandon in 2007, and AC Early Arctic, which was registered by a private BC company in 2002. And those 2 yielded 10% better than the bottom 3 orchard grasses. But again, those top 2 varieties weren't the best everywhere. AC Killarney was the best in Utah, and AC Early Arctic was the best in St. Augustin, Quebec. But there were other varieties that did better in Beaver Lodge, and there were 2 experimental populations that did the best in Normandin, Saskatoon, and Swift Current. And Tall Fescue didn't have a variety by location interaction. So Courtney, which is an old variety that came out of BC back in 1987, and an experimental population from the University of Saskatchewan, those 2 yielded the best at all locations, and they outperformed the bottom 2 tall fescue varieties by like 53%. That's not to say those other 2 weren't good. They may well have done quite well in other environments, but in the the 7 or so different places they looked at here, they weren't the best. Now, in terms of Timothy, the 3 overall highest yielding varieties included CDC Tisno, which is a new one from the University of Saskatchewan, Climax, which came from Ag Canada Ottawa in 1947, and an experimental Utah population. So these 3 out-yielded the bottom variety by 24%. CDC Tisno yielded well in Millville, Utah, Normandin, Quebec, and Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Climax yielded well in Panguitch, Utah, and the Utah population yielded best in Swift Current. Experimental populations from Agriculture Quebec performed best in St. Augustin, Quebec. So there's a lot of stuff there, but here's the point. Here's what this means to you. Variety is important. Not all meadow bromes are the same, and the same thing goes for all the other grasses and legumes. This paper focused on yield, but the same concept applies to other forage traits like winter hardiness and nutritional value and digestibility. Just because a variety was developed locally doesn't mean it's going to be the best choice for your situation. Sometimes a variety developed elsewhere might work best for you. The key is to choose a variety that is adapted to your local conditions, regardless of where it originated from. Now, over time, long-term collaborative variety trials like this should help to develop more refined variety selection recommendations for different climatic and soil zones. And this project is ongoing, and it has since expanded to include breeders in Lethbridge, Alberta, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Nepean, Nova Scotia. So the bottom line is that the beef industry support for forage breeding can be traced back to producers who spoke up. The Beef Cattle Research Council has launched an online survey to inform Canada's forage cattle and beef research priorities over the next 5 years. So here's your chance to speak up. Please visit beefresearch.ca and lend us 15 minutes of your time to help us guide how your checkoff dollars get invested in research. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.